Okay, so it's really nice to be with you. And thank you for inviting me, Chris and Herb. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to a project that I work on. I'm then going to describe an aspect of that project in a little bit of detail. And then I'm going to share with you some simple learning that's happened as a result of that project. And I'm going to break down some of the things we've learned into simple ideas which I think are useful and can be transposed and used in other contexts. And finally, because my talk is called The Power of Story, I'm going to share a little bit about my story because it very much connects to what I'm talking about. Before I go any further, let me just see if this clicker works. It does, good. However, oh yes, it's working fine, good. Okay, so the project I'm talking to you about goes under the title of Storying Sheffield. Storying Sheffield. And it's been running now for a couple of years, based at the University of Sheffield. And it now encompasses quite a number of initiatives. However, those initiatives are united by some common ideas. So, very briefly, those initiatives are united by ideas about ordinary, so-called ordinary lives and stories being rich, complex resources for knowledge and creativity. And those ordinary lives and stories are often, too often, not exploited and mined for the wisdom, for the creativity that they hold. So I'm interested in valuing, understanding ordinary lives and ordinary stories. And from that process of supporting people to create and articulate their own knowledge. And all of the pictures you'll see are images from some of the activities that Storying Sheffield is involved in. That lady's called Ruby, the older lady on the screen. And Ruby, I think, is now 90. She worked in the Sheffield Steelworks during World War II when her husband was called to fight. And her life was suddenly disrupted in an extraordinary way. And her story is remarkable. What you see there is Ruby in a university space, in a collaborative environment, getting to know Jenny, a young woman, a Sheffield student. And together, Ruby and Jenny and other similar partnerships collaborated and made a remarkable film, capturing something about the way in which women's lives have changed over the last 60 or so years, capturing something about the connections that can be made between women across time. And I encourage you to go on our website and look at it because the film's there. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about is where Storying Sheffield started. And this is a picture of one of the first things that we did. Storying Sheffield is a course at the University of Sheffield. It's a course that undergraduate students can opt into, and if they do it and they pass, they get credit for it, and it goes towards their final degree. It's an unusual course, though, because 50% of the people on the course are not undergraduates. 50% of the people on the course, up till now, we're changing the people we work with, but generally 50% of the people on the course are Sheffield citizens who have profound psychiatric disabilities. Usually the people we work with have been unemployed for many years on disability benefits, seriously disabled by quite profound psychiatric conditions. Though that 50% of our course are registered as students at the University of Sheffield, they have full rights to everything any student has access to. They participate in the seminars, the workshops, and the lectures just as any undergraduate does. They sit through the same lectures, they do the same things, they're part of a team. What is the course aimed at? Well, there's several things it's aimed at, but what we're interested in is understanding what narratives are, understanding how stories work, and then making stories from the raw material that we all bring into the workshops. In other words, ourselves, our knowledges and our histories. And we work towards an endpoint of a public exhibition, a celebration in which a huge variety of narrative artifacts are displayed, from digital creations to paintings to stories to performances to films. And those exhibitions, we've had 2 now, and the big events have been remarkable, wonderful, life-affirming things. So just very briefly on what happens in the course. We have academic input. We have professors coming along, talking to us about everything from performance to the history of maps, to the way in which buildings tell stories, to the way in which working class life in the north of England has been portrayed in film over the last century or so. So we have a kind of lecture thing. And then after that, everybody in the workshops joins together and uses the ideas to do stuff, to draw our own maps, make our own films, do our own bits of writing. So they're collaborative, hands-on workshops in which people work in mixed teams. And you can see some images as I go of team workings in the seminars and classes. And as I say, we work towards this endpoint, this exhibition, this statement. This exhibition is important. It feels like it's important because what happens is stories that generally don't get told are being told, are taking their place within the public sphere, are intervening in public discourse. Now, the course was never set up as a therapeutic thing. However, the outcomes have been quite remarkable. People, I would say 70 to 80% of the people who do the course have made extremely positive changes in their life after and as a result of the course. Everything from going back into work after years unable to, through taking up volunteering opportunities, to, well, perhaps the most interesting change, actually, and probably the most important one. All those things are important, but one of the most interesting things is what's happening at the moment, in that when the course ended, the non-undergraduate participants decided to carry on meeting, connecting, and they are staging an exhibition in October of their own artwork and productions. And they're a group of people who actually, they have, and up till quite recently did, lead very isolated existences. And as a result of coming together in the course, collaborating together, they've made connections and are now working together in a sustainable, autonomous team. Just a few more images before I give you a few learning points. This is a picture of our public exhibition this year, and another one. I think that's last year's exhibition. I hope that gives you a flavour of what actually happens. So I've given you a very brief outline of what the course is about. let me just share with you some of the learning that's happened. One of the first things I want to say, and this is not a piece of learning that's come from Storying Sheffield, but I'm very interested in it. I'm interested in it because my background as an academic is in theories about narrative, how narrative affects us, how stories are intrinsic to what it is to be human. Stories are ubiquitous. They're all around us. In one sense, we are ourselves stories. Stories have power as well. Stories are not just things we tell or hear. Stories make things happen in the world. And I'll give you a very concrete example about that in a minute. The other thing I want to say is that stories aren't always told. Stories sometimes emerge from situations. And what we've found in the workshops is that a community is created which coheres, and a story is formed about the community of undergraduates and non-undergraduates and academics who work together. And that story is about the power of collaboration. It's about the ability of people from extremely disparate backgrounds to cohere as a group which can achieve something. One of the things we've learned is that very mixed groups, people from extremely different backgrounds, if you get the conditions right, can cohere in extraordinary ways and achieve extraordinary things, can build extremely strong relationships which last and can create change. But as a counterweight to this, stories aren't always positive things. One of my main research interests is in mental illness. Stories can be extremely negative and disempowering. Stories which are told about you, especially perhaps if you're from a marginalised, disempowered background, can increase your sense of stigma and isolation. And it's not just as simple as saying, change the story that you tell about yourself or that is told about you. Stories come from different places, and some places have more power than others. I'm going to kind of draw these strands together in a minute, but two other points of learning that we've kind of understood. Education can be, and perhaps should be, participative and empowering. In other words, education at its best is not about passivity, but is about contribution. And finally, universities can be, and in my view should be, far more porous than they are. Open to the cities, the regions that surround them. Open to creative, mutual exchanges between the city's citizens and the academics and students who work within the university. Not because we're interested in doing good to poor, disadvantaged communities, although that's an admirable aim, but actually it's far more interesting than that. Our students, through working on Storying Sheffield, learn huge amounts from that process. Things that you can't pick up in textbooks. Complicated social abilities to work with people from very, very different groups indeed. And all sorts of other things too. So in other words, what I'm talking about, this porosity, is mutually beneficial. Okay, so I said I'd finish with something about me. I'm an academic. I've worked as an academic at the University of Sheffield now for about 8 years. And before that, I had lived a life very similar to many of the people who come onto the course. And it's impossible, really, for me to talk about the course without talking about myself, although I don't particularly enjoy it, but it seems relevant. I first became extremely mentally ill when I was 14. By the time I was 19, I was in a mental hospital. By the time I was 20, I was a suicide survivor. By the time I was 23, I was homeless. And that went on in total for around 2 decades. In that 20 years or so, I was usually far too disabled to work. When I was able to work, it was in manual, very low paid, unfulfilling occupations, none of which lasted long because I couldn't cope. My life was often very, very hard indeed. I'm not saying my life has been remarkable, because it hasn't. In fact, there are many people like me out there. However, what's important in this story is what changed all that. Oh, there is a timer there. I've got 2 minutes, 30 seconds. This is perfect. My timing is great. That's good. All right, so this is absolutely excellent. What changed all this? Okay, well, I'd left school around 15, no qualifications to speak of. No one from my family had ever been to university. I came from quite humble sort of background. But I'd always been interested in learning until kind of things went wrong. In my mid-30s, my life had stabilised enough for me to consider putting my toe in the water of education. Now, I'd made several attempts before and failed. And I found a little access course for adults who, like me, had left school early. And this access course was running at the University of Sheffield. So at 6 o'clock on a Monday night each week, I would turn up to the University of Sheffield with brickies, women who'd perhaps given up a career to raise children or whatever, and we'd sit in a little room and we'd study. Well, first of all, we'd study how to study. So we'd learn how to read a textbook and all that sort of stuff. And I was incredibly nervous about it. But suddenly, no, it wasn't suddenly, gradually, I began to realise there was something rather good in this. And yeah, some of it was about learning about social science and history. But actually what was really good about it was connecting with other people with a shared purpose and discovering that I had something to offer, that I could connect with others in a meaningful way, that I could offer something, they could offer something back to me. And through that process, and it was actually gradual, my story began to change. Because if you are chronically mentally ill, you get very used to a story about you which only talks about deficit and lack, what you can't do, what you're not good at, what's gone wrong. You have to tell that story so often to your doctor, to your social worker, to your psychiatrist, to your benefits advisor. You have to tell it so often, it gets told to you so often, that eventually you just come to believe it, and it actually becomes who you are. What happened for me on that access course was I suddenly realised there were other stories I could tell about myself. Yes, all that stuff was true. Life was, and actually still is, quite a struggle. But actually I realised there's a lot of things I'm good at. Some people quite like me. Some people probably don't, but you get the picture. There were positive stories I could tell about myself too. And because I was working with other people, those positive stories were reinforced. There was a counterweight to that negativity that I could never have achieved on my own. A new story began to emerge in my life through this kind of collaborative process of working together with others. So I find myself now at the age of 53 with my own office, in a university with a good salary, and talking to you, which is quite extraordinary to me, that I find myself in this position, and it's wonderful. And I use my story, if I need to connect with people. It doesn't mean I can understand everything about other people who've had mental health problems, but it does mean to say we probably can find some point of connection. And my personal knowledge, I value just as much as my academic knowledge. Yes, I've read all the research. Yes, I can talk in jargon and blind you, or pretend I'm blinding you with science if I want to. But actually, what I really value is my personal knowledge. And it's opened doors to disadvantaged, isolated people in our city in ways which I value greatly. And I think I'll end it there. Thank you.